Croeso ADREF, welcome to the first episode of ADREF, the End Youth Homelessness Cymru podcast. I'm your host, Beth Gallivan, and I work at End Youth Homelessness Cymru, or EYHC, as the Youth Voice and Engagement Coordinator. My job is to connect young people who've got lived experience of homelessness with policymakers, decision makers who are making decisions about them. I'm also joined by our Head of Service, Bill Rowlands.
Hi Beth, pleasure to be on the first episode of ADREF, the End Youth Homelessness Cymru podcast. I've been with EYHC for about 3.5 years now and really excited to be getting the podcast off the ground.
I think with everything we've learned about youth homelessness from the time that EYHC has existed, we've come to understand that it's far from just a housing issue. There are lots of things that contributed to youth homelessness in Wales, and so every episode we're going to be talking to a range of guests to discuss those different issues, including experts by profession and experts by experience.
Yeah, and I think what the podcast is going to give us is just a really exciting way to make our research more accessible. I think since you've come into your post, Beth, and we've looked to make sure that EYHC means more to the young people of Wales, across Wales, we're really hopeful that this podcast can be an avenue to increase the accessibility of our research and raise awareness about youth homelessness more broadly in Wales. As we know, it's not a situation that's getting better, so we're hoping this can raise the awareness of the issue across Wales.
Yeah, 100%. And I think it's also really important to amplify the voices of young people with lived experience. So every episode, we're talking to a young person as well as professionals who have lived experience of the issue at hand. However, this episode, we're not talking to young people because the purpose is to introduce End Youth Homelessness Cymru, our history, our purpose, and our goals going forward.
So who better to be joined today than by two people who are absolutely integral to the foundation of EYHC and continue to be so important in driving our work forward today. Professor Pete Mackie, the CEO of ail-fframio, Francis Beecher.
Welcome to the first episode of the End Youth Homelessness Cymru podcast. We are really excited to be here with the two co-founders of End Youth Homelessness Cymru. Firstly, we have Fran Beecher, who is the chair of EYHC and the CEO of ail-fframio, which is one of the largest homelessness charities in Wales, which supports thousands of women and young people experiencing homelessness, with Fran at the helm for over 20 years. We're also joined by Professor Pete Mackie, who is the Vice Chair of EYHC and an internationally renowned academic on housing and homelessness. Pete's work on the conceptualisation of prevention has influenced countries all over the world, as well as in the UK, and has been instrumental in helping us consolidate our relationships with partners and colleagues across the globe. We're going to be having a chat about the history of EYHC, why it exists, how it came to exist, and why it's still important. So I'd like to start with you, Bill, if you could just give us an overview for anyone who isn't familiar with EYHC about who we are and what we do.
Yeah, of course, lovely. Thank you, Beth. And yeah, as you said, really exciting to get the podcast off the ground. So we formed back in 2017 as a result of a successful cross-organisational and cross-sector campaign against the placement of 16 and 17-year-olds in unsupported temporary accommodation. So obviously that accommodation commonly looked like B&Bs or hotels where a number of young people were being placed in very close proximity to individuals which they shouldn't have been placed close to. And I think what was important about this campaign was it was the first time the sector kind of viewed youth homelessness as something distinct and as something that was unique and not just of young people going through a system made for adults. So as a result of that successful campaign, the then First Minister Carwyn Jones pledged to end youth homelessness in 10 years, giving us a 10-year timeline to work towards from 2017 to 2027. And that pledge led to the creation of EYHC, so the continuation of that campaign, and also the creation of the youth homeless coordinator posts in every local authority. From the start, we've been a coalition and will continue to be a coalition. And I think that gives us real strength in knowing that we're representing the views of 30 organisations across Wales, all united behind this goal of trying to tackle youth homelessness in Wales.
The thing to acknowledge, I suppose, is that neither Bill or I were involved with EYHC when it was originally founded back in 2017, but obviously Pete and Fran were both heavily involved. So would you mind sharing from your perspective how that started and how you got involved?
Okay, well, it started because as CEO of Llymai, I was hearing more and more horrific stories of young people who had been placed in bed and breakfast accommodation, unsuitable and often notorious hotels, where young people were basically on the streets all the way through during the day. When they came home, they didn't have anywhere safe. They didn't have rooms with a lock or a shower with a lock. And what prompted me to think we've got to do something about this is 2 serious sexual assaults on one young woman and one young man. And when Llymai, in its own inimitable way, contacted the local authorities, it was, oh, this is a one-off, this is unusual. And as a consequence, I contacted some sister organisations across Wales and said, are you experiencing this as well? They were, and I asked them to come together and form a campaign to shame local authorities, but also to try and hold directors of social services accountable for sign-offs of putting young people in inappropriate places and unsupported accommodation. Llymai got together and worked with these 4 organisations and brought a campaign together, and a campaign that started to bear traction. We succeeded in reducing the use of bed and breakfast, and we also succeeded in changing some of the policy around that and ensuring that significant decision makers like directors and deputy directors of social services were taking responsibility and accountability, and also ensuring that young people had a level of support during their time in these inappropriate places. And that is where I guess the idea of coming together, it was clear that we could reach further, we could be heard a little bit easier by coming together and not in the divide and rule that third sector charities usually have thrust upon them. So we're in competition with our sister organisations, and therefore we don't come together. So the idea of End Youth Homeless Cymru came, and at the time there was a London and England-based coalition, End Youth Homelessness UK, which wasn't about practice, which was more about fundraising. So I basically stole the title with permission, obviously, in my own way, and End Youth Homeless Cymru was born. Then contacted the minister at the time, Carl Sargent, and had a meeting with both Carl and Carwyn. And that meeting fell on open ears. They were very interested in the idea that actually if we could harness research and look at what was best practice, then we had an opportunity of reducing youth homelessness across Wales. I was as delighted as anyone when Carwyn announced £10 million to put into ending youth homelessness. I was then impressed that they hadn't asked the experts, which were young people and frontline organisations, how to spend that money. But it was a pivotal moment. The second person, apart from these ministers, I contacted was the amazing Professor Pete Mackie, who I said, look, we need a coalition of organisations, businesses, people. We need to be a voice. And Pete was amazing. What can I do? How can I do it? And between us, we then developed a structure that then was a steering group made up of some of the significant policymakers in Wales, which was the First Minister, the leader of the WLGA, the Future Gens, Sophie Howe, and the Children's Commissioner as well. And they were people who were saying, yes, this is really, really important. And we gave ourselves 10 years to get somewhere.
And how about you, Pete? What's your memory of that time?
Fran's articulated it really well. That's the story. I got brought along to support as I could, but really as part of that steering group was my role, and when I entered alongside the very many others that were representative of third sector local authorities, business, government, etc. So that was really when I came on board.
Okay, and what do you think made the campaign successful? Like, why do you think it was effective in reaching government and changing policy in practice?
Because we managed to get an amazing celebrity behind us. Let's be honest. Let's be honest. The incredible Michael Sheen, who supported us and accepted the challenge that rather than always addressing youth homelessness once it became a problem, trying to put in crisis support, we had to get behind the problem. We had to start looking at ways that we could reach young people first, because that's what young people have always said to us in Llamai. Why didn't you reach me sooner? Why didn't you help me before things had completely fallen apart? And Michael came down to Llamai. We had an amazing full day session asking young people what they needed and what they wanted. They came up with, they wanted a helpline. They wanted somewhere that they could contact, whether it was a bank holiday, whether it was 3 o'clock in the morning. And Michael got behind that. He also got behind the petition. And he was part of us delivering that campaign straight into Welsh Government. I would like to think our voices mattered, and in fairness, I know they do. But sometimes when you have somebody who is willing to put their following and their strength behind voices of young people, it really, really helped. And Michael was pivotal in getting End Youth Homeless Cymru up and running. He became our patron. If it hadn't been for Michael Sheen, then I don't think we would have got the traction, we wouldn't have got the publicity, and we wouldn't have got under the skin of quite so many people, because that's why End Youth Homeless Cymru is important. We need to get behind the skin of policymakers who mean well, but often do not understand, and they get a diluted message about what it's actually like to experience youth homelessness, what it's actually like to be in that crisis point. And thanks to Michael, we were able to project that message.
Obviously, you mentioned it was a coalition, which we still now operate as a coalition. And throughout the course of the podcast, we'll be talking to lots of our colleagues. But what do you think are the benefits of a coalition approach, and why was that so important to you in the early days of EYHC?
I remember saying that no one person, no one organisation, no one department could actually end youth homelessness. If we are serious about ending youth homelessness, and it can be done, make no mistake about it, it is a political choice to accept youth homelessness. It can be done, but only if we all come together. And that was the whole premise. Unless we come together and we follow the voices and we follow the experiences of those unfortunate enough to have been let down by us all, then we're not going to make progress. And the coalition and that united voice is really, really important.
Yeah, and just on that, Beth, day to day, I just think what a collective breadth of expertise we have across Wales, formed by coalition. That's what it offers us as a free, me, you and Sean, day to day, obviously working on the different tasks of EYHC every year. Just we have that fountain of knowledge, fountain of understanding from all over Wales. So the differences of youth homelessness, as we'll obviously unpick in later episodes, the differences in how youth homelessness manifests itself in Carnarvon compared to Cardiff. We've got that fountain of knowledge and understanding of what that looks like, and it's just an ability to have a far greater understanding than we could from obviously the office in which we work. So I just think day to day it's been a huge benefit to us having that united buy-in and that united front. And obviously, as Fran's talked about, having that united front outwardly looking as well from a campaign point of view is just so important.
And I think the campaign started on point of crisis. It was the worst form of crisis, as Fran described, in terms of the origins of EYHC. But the goal was to prevent homelessness. And that really meant we had to stop talking just amongst ourselves that we're mostly working at point of crisis. I know Plamai and others have a lot of prevention services, but the majority of time is spent after somebody has become homeless. That's where most of the activity was happening. And so you needed the new partners that could actually, they were the ones that were seeing young people and interacting with young people far earlier in their lives. Education became a really valuable partner around that table. We had a lot of conversations with education in those early days that we hadn't been having. And you could say that about pretty much everyone around the table. So it became even more important because of the goal, because of the focus on prevention, that those folk were around the table. It couldn't just be the usual suspects.
Yeah, no, that's so important. And on that, Pete, what do you mean by prevention when we talk about it in this context?
Yeah, I think we went on a bit of a journey in terms of our understanding of prevention. There was the fairly basic understanding when we started. We roughly knew what we meant, but since that point, I've been involved in doing bits of work with good colleague Suzanne Fitzpatrick and a couple of others on this, and then that trickled through into kind of the roadmap that the EYHC produced. But very much at the starting point, this idea of what we call universal prevention, and that's the stuff that we should just be doing right for everybody to make sure that everybody has access to good health, to an income, to relationships that are healthy and supportive, to access to education. Those what we call protective factors, and that's a good universal preventive system. If as a society we can have those things in place, we'll go a long way towards preventing youth homelessness and all forms of homelessness. And then you get into what we call kind of upstream or more targeted prevention. And that's for the groups that we know are at greater risk. Young people as a group in and of themselves are at greater risk for a whole heap of reasons that I'm sure the other podcasts will get into a lot of detail. But then there are particular groups of young people at greater risk. And making sure that we're working with those young people early on before crises, because we know that there's a risk down the road. So when we talk about prevention, we talk about those universal steps that we do for everybody, the kind of upstream targeted steps. And then there's even prevention, which is the way we were mostly thinking about it before, that is kind of crisis stage prevention, is what our homelessness legislation in Wales and England does. It says, look, homelessness is happening in a month or so's time, we know, because you've been evicted. Now we'll act. And so there's a whole load of activity and opportunities there. But really, the goal was, what can we do as early as possible? That was the way we started to think about prevention, these different time points at which we can intervene with different population groups. Yeah, and that's framed a lot of the thinking, I think.
Brilliant. Yeah, that is 100% the kind of foundation of EYHC, is thinking about it in the preventative terms. But again, for anyone who's kind of new to the subject, why is it important to have EYHC as a campaign about youth homelessness specifically? Why do we need to treat that slightly differently rather than just lumping it in with all forms of homelessness?
So, I mean, the reason that youth homelessness is completely and utterly distinct is because young people, the predominant issue is the relationship breakdown, the loss of family, where that is a care home breakdown, whether that's foster placement, failed adoption, whatever. But young people's brains are entirely different. And unless we treat them as a different group and put in specific measures to support those young people, to support the development of that brain, we are condemning them to a lifetime of homelessness. And I think that is the most important thing. We have a real responsibility to look at and target young people who are experiencing things that, unless we change, they will continue, and Pete's research shows that almost 50% of young people who became homeless before the age of 21 have a lifetime of homelessness. And it's very frustrating because it's kind of common sense. You don't treat a 6-year-old the same as you treat a 16-year-old. You don't treat a 16-year-old the same as you treat a 26-year-old in any sphere, in any sector. And yet we seem to having to prove in Wales and to the policymakers that it is absolutely fundamental to have a different methodology for young people.
No, I always find, because we obviously talk about it a lot, Fran, but your point about the psychology and the impacts on the brain are all really important ones that folk don't talk about. So that's one really important distinctive point about why you have to act early with young people. The other one that Fran was saying is, look, the triggers are different. And then, look, even if you do feel obliged to just focus on adult homelessness as a society, because it's the thing that's most visible and on the streets, that's where policy tends to target. That's true. Even if you feel obliged that that's where you're going to spend your money, if you really want to prevent adult homelessness, as Fran said, for at least half of those adults, things started in childhood. They started, their first episode of homelessness was before 21, but actually, when you look at the adversities that those folk have faced in childhood, it started in childhood way before 21. So for all of those reasons, it tells you we have to work earlier on, and we have to work with young people, and it's not either or. This isn't only youth homelessness. This is an and. We need to do work at point of crisis with adults, and we need to do work with young people that is different and is distinct. If we're going to end youth homelessness, if we're going to end homelessness.
And the whole crux of the £10 million that Carwyn gave was to enable us to look at prevention whilst without losing the crisis intervention. Carwyn and Carl Sargent understood that there needed to be an injection of money to allow us to continue with the crisis and look at the prevention until we had reached a stage where that prevention was preventing that feed through that tsunami into crisis. And one of my great frustrations, and I will never shut up about it, it was that research that came around the amazing upstream model. Welsh Government put money in and found the upstream model that had the opportunity of preventing homelessness before homelessness had actually become on the table for an awful lot of young people. What an amazing, brilliant, proactive thing to do. And yet, because we have policymakers whose ears are too clogged by policy to actually try and make this work. And until we can unclog their ears, we're going to keep banging on about it, or I'm going to keep banging on about it. How dare you spend that money, find that research, and then poo-poo it?
I think it's obviously one of the key asks of EYHC. Is one of the policies and schemes we're most passionate about and feel as one of the biggest opportunities to really revolutionise youth homelessness in Wales, and the prevention of youth homelessness. And I think it really does embody that shift in prevention that Pete's talked about. So I think it maybe is worth just quickly contextualising what upstream is. Pete, I don't know if you want to potentially do it more succinctly than I do.
I'm happy to. So, it was one of several things that the Canadian study pointed out as effective and successful. And upstream is a school-based intervention, secondary school. Young people complete a survey. The survey identifies young people who are potentially at risk. That leads to a conversation with a professional who then actually essentially gets to the bottom of whether there are issues here and whether support might be needed. And then there's an offer of support for the young people, their family, and primarily the support is about mediation, because the main issue that's being identified is relationship breakdown. But it can be a suite of other actions that are about young person's wider engagement. And in the Australian context, where this has been implemented for the longest and they've got the best data, it led to a 40% reduction in youth homelessness. So there was a really strong recommendation that this is something you should explore. And that came through back in 2017, 2018, whenever the report came out.
And we have England and Scotland and now Ireland very, very interested in starting to implement pilots and to run this across. And yet we don't have funding in Wales to successfully do this, even though we brought it to the UK.
I think upstream is a really, really good practical example of effective prevention. What else? Not necessarily specific projects, but like in general, what does that shift in focus towards prevention look like in practice?
It's a good one. I think it's worth noting that we've we've got a bit of law coming in that takes many of the good principles of upstream and puts that into statute. So the law that is currently being proposed is that public bodies will have a duty to identify people at risk who are interacting with their public body and then take action within their own resources and also make referral to housing teams, but to take action and to identify people at risk. Lots of the very practical details are still to be worked out, but upstream would be an example of an education system doing that. Now, not all young people will be engaging effectively with education in that way, so it will work for most, but actually you've also got the opportunity to do that within health systems and other public systems. And of course, it's not just for young people, it's for adults. But that principle of identifying who's at risk and then taking action to support those people in whatever, whether it's a public system or some other space in which we're having interactions with folk. I'd also argue that sometimes these practice examples, they're like projects, they're like one-off interventions. We also need system change, because too often when you're identifying a challenge and an opportunity to support somebody early, other systems are getting in your way. Other systems aren't answering the door. Other systems have set a threshold so blooming high that young person with, some mental health issues actually just can't get into that service. And if we could just bring thresholds lower, then we wouldn't be getting to some of these higher threshold sports. So there's also wider system change that's not as easy to articulate, and it's not a one-off intervention that you can take off the shelf.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with Pete more. I mean, it's the interconnectivity. I mean, I've knocked Welsh Government and I've knocked some of the policymakers, but the then Minister Julie James did bring in additional money for example, youth workers that were focused on working with groups of young people who were more likely to become homeless. That was a phenomenal move and it was much welcomed. But as Pete says, the problem we have is a systemic one. And I'm sure we'll go on to EYH's phenomenal immersive experience of how systems are actually stopping young people coming to the system. It's not no wrong door. It's basically, as I always equated to, a pinball machine. These young people get, flicked everywhere across, and where they come through to, nobody knows. And that's partly because systems are overstretched and they are gatekeeping by raising the crisis level. So, exactly as Pete says, people cannot access services early enough and are left to languish until they hit the DEFCON. That means they can, receive services, by which time an awful lot has happened, and very often the way back into the community, the way back into developing the family network is nigh on impossible. So we've got to be open and honest about that. We're not, and it's back to the premise of End Youth Homeless Cymru, we are not going to end youth homelessness merely by some incredible projects and some working. We are only going to do it when all the systems start to work. We're running out of time for End Youth Homeless Cymru's target, but the one thing we need to be very clear of is we ain't going away and we're not going to stop until we achieve it.
Well, that feels like a good place for me to ask the difficult question of how close do you think we are to that initial goal of ending youth homelessness by 2027?
Not a cat's chance in hell. I will give the caveat that, the result of COVID did quite understandably take people away from that particular focus. And I cannot not applaud Welsh Government, local authorities for the way they responded and brought people in safely during the pandemic to keep people alive. But if we take the 2-3 years out of COVID, we are still a long way off. And until we are invested in early intervention and in prevention, across Wales. And we have education, social services, homelessness, mental health working together. We're trying to dam something, and as we're trying to dam there, then the water's coming over the top or through. And I think I applaud End Youth Homeless Cymru because we've done the research. Obviously, new research keeps coming, and it's really important we keep abreast of that. But somebody needs to be saying, and End Youth Homeless Cymru is saying, we need action now. Enough of the talking. I've said I will never, ever sit round a table again and discuss how to end homelessness. We have to challenge the short-termism of politics, and we have to say we're not interested in that anymore. We need action. And that action has to be the early intervention and prevention. I think if we had the political will, we could certainly stop young people coming into services without having been identified and supported. And we could do that within a 3 to 5 year period. And I think that's where we've got to put the pressure on.
Making it system-wide, the prevention efforts, where we've got pockets of things that are proving to be really quite effective. They're not system-wide. We're not very good at sharing things that appear to be working and then going quickly to go to scale. We've not been good at that in this period since the First Minister made the commitment. But it is also worth recognising how much the landscape has changed since the commitment was made. Most of that is not specific to young people. I just had a quick look at the numbers, but if you looked at the number of outcomes within our statutory systems, those are folk that make it into, you've reached crisis pretty much, you're into our statutory homelessness system. 2018-19, you were talking about 3,150 young people headed households. So they're 18 to 24 year olds. 3,100. That's now, in the latest numbers, sort of 22, 23, that's 2,150 people. There are very few places in the world where that's the trajectory. Very, 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 very few. We don't talk about that because I don't think anybody's looked at those numbers. But the crucial one, I would say, is we had a bit of an all or nothing system in our safety net up until essentially COVID. And that was called the priority need system. And it really badly affected our 18 to 24 year olds because they were disadvantaged by the welfare benefit system already and through many other disadvantages. And they weren't in priority need. That's now essentially changed. And those are people, if you're not in priority need, it basically means we've tried to help you. We didn't succeed. Now go away. And we've thrown resource at you and people time to find accommodation and we failed. Now you're on your own. That's what priority need essentially said. It is mind-blowing that it existed in this century. We've moved away, and that's Welsh Government-led, moved away from that. So we did have, in 2018-19, 450 young people headed households who were in that situation, 450 households headed by young people who were basically told there's now nothing. That's now down to 50 people. So again, there are things that have happened since we started the campaign and since EYHC started that are generally the system has changed where the safety net has shifted. But where we need to be, we haven't made the inroads because it has to be prevention. People have to not need to enter our statutory safety net, our system, our safety net. And even then, some of the safety net, the quality of what you're getting isn't good. But it is important that whole story is told because there's been a lot of change in that
I
period
don't
of time.
disagree with Pete, but I do put a help.
You put a button there. That means you do disagree.
I put a button there in that I don't believe that our statutory figures are as accurate. And I think we have to acknowledge that for every one young person that is counted in that system, there are at least another 3 that haven't even got into that system because they're not being picked up. So I don't want to say there isn't some good work being done, and I don't want to say, but there is a huge caveat. We would say that this time in Wales, there's around 6,000 young people who are homeless that haven't. And that's one of the reasons we put in the homeless helpline, which has seen over a 50% increase year on year of young people who've tried to get in help with the statutory system, and then only because they've been picked up by an organisation that can actually say, right, okay, X, Y, and Z, you have to. So I just want to add that caveat, but I don't disagree. There is a different system and we are trying our best. But I think as well, it would be unfair not to mention, we have to acknowledge that the complexity of need, the situations that young people have found themselves in, particularly since the pandemic, have gone through the roof. The levels of abuse, exploitation, trauma, mental health is very frightening. And as a consequence, to me, it's even more important we find them earlier, because by the time they're into statutory services, by the time they're hitting the thresholds, hand on heart, the ability to support people to turn their lives around, phenomenally hard. And I see my colleagues work miracles alongside people who are desperate to make changes day in, day out. But by God, that challenge has increased.
Yeah, and I think that's maybe a good point to just jump in where Fran's saying they're flawed by what's going on. Obviously, the data that we've collated from FOI and local authorities has shown that since 2017 to now, the average number of days spent in TA for an 18 to 25-year-old has gone from 66 days to 113. That just kind of contextualizes and really embodies the housing crisis that all of Wales are facing, but how that manifests itself for young people. We know, so you have to think there that might be a 16, 17-year-old or a 18 or 19-year-old and either doing their GCSEs or doing their A-levels and trying to do that while you're living in temporary accommodation, either as part of a family unit or as a single household. It's just the knock-on effects of that and everything we're talking about in terms of prevention and all the life opportunities for these young people to spend. And some local authorities, it's coming in, the average time is over a year. So you really can't detract from the knock-on effects or the damaging effects that is going to have on those young people, and then all of the likelihood about homelessness reoccurring later on the line. I agree completely with Pete and the fact that I think we can't be too down on ourselves about the situation. There are pockets of really good practice. There are things at that statutory level, as Pete was explaining, that are looking positive. But we know that once young people are coming into the system, it still continues to be really bleak. And we've obviously got a fair bit of work forthcoming around those experiences, both in temporary accommodation and also the private rented sector, and what the quality of that accommodation is like in both of those options. And it's not good, obviously. So I think that just really embodies why that focus on prevention has to be unrelenting. And as Franz reiterates, it has to be unrelenting and it has to be unapologetic. We will continue to bang the door and we will continue to annoy people. We'll continue to piss people off, because if that's what it takes, that's what it takes. Because we all know on the call that once you're in the system, the options aren't great, because the systems are so stretched and because the whole system as a whole, then the whole of the housing options are so stretched that unfortunately we know that for so many young people the quality of that will be horrendous. It will be horrendous, and it will have such damaging and seismic impacts on their life opportunities going forward.
Yeah, and don't get me wrong, I'm giving you the objective professor perspective on the data. I am as angry and frustrated about the lack of speed at which we've taken up things that we know to work in the prevention space. I think it's also just, it reminded me something I hadn't said that was important, that comes out of conversations with folk who are working in this prevention space in my team and others, is that actually when you're working in that space, the conversations are about well-being. The word homelessness is very, very rarely used, and all the labels and the stigmas that get attached, but also just the harm that you've described, Bill, of being in TA for a year. The whole conversation and the nature of what you're doing in those conversations, what you're trying to achieve, it changes totally. It's about well-being, wider well-being, and that is absolutely the space that we want to be in, and the time point at which we want to be intervening and having these conversations.
Yeah, 100%. I think I think we could all sit here all day and night and rant about our various gripes with how we can improve things. So just before we finish, I just want to talk a little bit about the future of EYHC, how it's evolved since it started, and where it's going now. So, Bill, over to you.
Thank you, Beth. I think it's kind of been alluded to throughout the conversation how the initial focus was on winning the argument around the distinctiveness, as Fran and Pete have so nicely articulated. And then we've obviously done the research into those groups that anecdotally we knew through conversations with practitioners, conversations with young people themselves, of those groups of young people are at a higher risk. And I think, again, has been alluded to throughout the conversation, it's that realization that this isn't just reliant on pockets improving. This really is that system level change that we're now advocating for. And I think with that has gone the focus, especially since you've come into role, on making sure that EYHC means more to the young people of Wales again, really being that vocal and obvious clear point for young people. So I think that's really important to note. And then I think what we've got now with the simulation is this real opportunity to embody what's wrong with the system as it currently stands. And I think, just for the listeners, the youth justice simulation or youth experiential learning simulation, both of which are a bit of a mouthful, came about through partners of ours in America, put together this simulation to try and make judges across America feel what it's like to be a young person. So the whole premise, the whole focus of said simulation is putting decision makers, policy makers, judges, people who interact with young people on a day-to-day in the shoes of young people, to try and demonstrate and articulate to them just how poorly systems work together, how they're not youth-led, and how they're not designed to work effectively for young people. And it's always a difficult one to try and explain, because hopefully a number of the listeners will go through the simulation at some point. So it's difficult to talk about it without giving away too much of it. But yeah, we're really excited for what it can achieve, what it can, as Wales' understanding of what it's like to be a young person and what these systems are currently not doing. Obviously, Pete's been instrumental in helping us roll this out across Wales, and obviously Fran has gone through it a couple of years ago, so I'm sure they'll have something to add. I think the simulation really embodies where we're going with EYHC in a nutshell. It really is looking to really get to the core of our system-based problem. How can we restructure systems to make sure they are really youth-facing and actually work for young people coherently?
Bill, I think it's also worth noting that once again that's being done as a collaboration and coalition, and people are giving up their time for free. So it involves the uni again, but it involves other universities, it involves local authorities, Cardiff City Football. So many partners have just come on and given their time for free because of how impactful it is. So it's that coalition of folk coming together.
Yeah, and that's a really important point to make, Pete. And I think we probably undersold it in the fact that obviously the American partners, to which we owe so much, have delivered this simulation, I think, over 100 times at least across the world. Initially, they came in contact with us because they're off to the UN's World Justice Forum to perform it in Brussels. They've run it how many times in America for Google, Facebook. They've run it in Delhi. They've run it all over the world, and they'll be able to attest to this. Every time they run the simulation, they're asked to share it, to share the secrets, to share how it's put together. And such was their reaction to the Welsh participants who went through it. In just they reflected, they realised that in Wales we got this. We really got what they were trying to achieve. The frontline workers, the practitioners who went through this, they got it. We got it. So we are the only country in the world to have had this simulation shared. So we are unique in the fact we have a team of facilitators who are able to put this on and continue to do so. Currently, there's plans ongoing to put this on in a far more structured and far more consistent way. But we are really blessed in Wales to have this opportunity, to have the gift of a simulation being gifted to us. And as Pete says, once again, it's because of a coalition and because of a cooperative nature in which we try to do everything.
No, absolutely. And I'll say I did it for the first time earlier this year, and it was, an unbelievable experience. And keep an eye on our social media and stuff. And if you ever get the chance to do it, please do it. But yeah, it is a really unique and impactful training experience, and I recommend it for anyone who works with young people. So I'm going to move on to the final question, which I'm going to be asking everyone who comes on this podcast. imagine you wake up tomorrow somehow and you find your First Minister of Wales now. What is the first thing you would be doing, the first thing you would implement as a step towards ending youth homelessness in Wales?
I do two things because I never follow the rules. First thing I would do was I would declare youth homelessness a protected characteristic in Wales, with all the caveats that requires, and as a special group. I would then implement Upstream Cymru in every single local authority, and I would develop it into the S system as mandatory. There we are.
Brilliant. And how about yourself, Pete? What would be your answer?
So it's a tricky one. Because if we recognise that the problem is our systems, that's the thing that we're trying to fix. I agree with Fran. Like Upstream maybe it helps with that, but I've got a golden ticket. I've got I can raise as much tax as I like. Then my intervention would be to properly fund our public services, our schools, our health systems, our welfare systems. Maybe First Minister can't quite do that, but those systems with the right people with the right time, because generally you very rarely meet people in these systems that don't want to do the things that we need to happen. They just simply don't have the time or the capacity. Imagine a teacher with a class of 15 pupils or a class of 20 pupils that's able to sit down and have a conversation every day about how things are going. The things that Upstream has to do on top of would be being done in routine ways, because you've got enough people in these spaces caring, supporting, and funding's not everything. Of course it's not. That's why I mentioned having right people in there and enough people there. But that something like that. I don't even know if the First Minister's got those powers, but
in this scenario, the First Minister does have those powers. Absolutely. So it's about system reform, wider implementation of Upstream, and giving public services the funding and the resources that they need to be able to deliver a high quality service for young people and beyond, essentially.
Do I get to say mine, or?
Oh yeah, sorry, you get to say yours. Yeah, sorry, Bill.
Thank you. To be fair, when we were prepping for this earlier, I had written down the two things that Fran and Pete had said. But third thing,
Great minds.
So at least we've got it's that coherent, united voice of a coalition. But at least the other thing I'd written down, and obviously I think this won't come as a surprise, is just listening to the voices of young people. I feel like we're slowly getting there as a country, as a sector, in listening to the voices of those with lived experience, of those young people who've been so unfortunate to have to go through the systems we're talking about, the systems that don't work for them, the systems that don't represent them, the systems they don't see themselves reflected in. But all of the best quality work that we have done and all of the best quality furthering of our understanding of the system has come when as EYHC, we've really proactively and well engaged with young people, and our understanding of those systems now is far higher than it ever would have been if we were just looking in, trying to unpick what was going on strategically. When we're actually engaging young people really productively and cooperatively, our understanding is far higher than it could be. So I think with that First Minister lens on, it would be listening to young people and enacting what they say, because they are, fortunately, through what they've gone through, the experts of how those systems work or don't work together. So I think that would be my answer.
I completely agree, and I just want to add that every single model of support in Llwyddiannus that we've developed was developed because young people said, we need X, Y, and Z. And even some of the ones we're now losing funding for was because young people said, this is what we want. And I think if you lose having that experience at the heart, then you're doing what every other professional, what every other system does, is telling people what they need to do. And there's nothing guaranteed to switch people off than that, is there?
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining us. It was a really interesting conversation. And yeah, I'm just sorry we can't dig into it more because I know we've all got a lot to say about it. But yeah, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Beth.
Lovely. Beth.
Thanks, Beth.
ADREF is produced by End Youth Homelessness Cymru and APOD. It's edited by Aled Jones from APOD. The music is July by John Patitucci. If you enjoy our show and want to support us, please leave us a rating. It helps a lot. If you'd like to learn more about EYHC and our work, you can head to our website, endyouthhomelessness.cymru, or search End Youth Homelessness Cymru on Instagram, TikTok, LinkedIn and X. Diolch am wrando, thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.